On May 4, 1961, a group of 7 African Americans and 6 white people left Washington, D.C., on the first Freedom ride in 2 buses bound for New Orleans. They were hoping to provoke the federal government into enforcing the 1960 Supreme Court ruling in Boynton v. Virginia, which forbade unjust discrimination, including in bus terminals, restrooms, and other facilities associated with interstate travel. As the Freedom Riders traveled into the Deep South, the white riders would use facilities designated for black people and vice versa. On May 14, in Alabama, 1 bus was firebombed and the riders were beaten. The second bus, as it arrived in Birmingham, was also attacked. Although law enforcement was late in responding, another set of Freedom Riders were undeterred and set out from Nashville to Birmingham, where, at the behest of Robert F. Kennedy, then the U.S. Attorney General, they were able to secure a new bus and protection from the State Highway Patrol to Montgomery, where the riders were again beaten. National Guard support was provided when 27 Freedom Riders continued on to Jackson, Mississippi, only to be arrested and jailed. On May 29, President John F. Kennedy ordered the Interstate Commerce Commission to enforce even stricter guidelines banning segregation in interstate travel. Still, Freedom Riders continued to travel by public transportation in the South until the dictate took effect in September. The history of the American civil rights movement is full of stories of such perseverance in the face of violence and stiff odds and successes coming at the end of long struggles. The following are 10 other defining moments in American civil rights. 10 Forever Free. The Civil War was the culmination of conflicts between advocates and opponents of slavery in the United States, and the fate of the millions of enslaved people was in the balance throughout the war. On January 1, 1863, however, the future became clear, as President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all persons held as slaves in the Confederate States fighting against the Union and made them thenceforward, and forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation did more than lift the war to the level of a fight for human freedom. It brought some substantial practical results, because it allowed the Union to recruit black soldiers. To this invitation to join the army, black people responded in considerable numbers, nearly 180,000 of them enlisting during the remainder of the war. By August 26, 1863, Lincoln could report, in a letter to James C. Conkling, that the emancipation policy, and the use of colored troops, constitute the heaviest blow yet dealt to the rebellion. 2 months before the war ended, in February 1865, Lincoln told portrait painter Francis B. Carpenter that the Emancipation Proclamation was the central act of my administration, and the greatest event of the 19th century. 9 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments ratified. Although substantially expanded political freedom for African Americans would not come until the 1960s, in the 1860s the Constitution was fundamentally altered to eliminate discrimination that had been enshrined in the founding document. The 13th Amendment, 1865, officially abolished slavery, the 14th, 1868, granted citizenship rights to formerly enslaved people, and the 15th, 1870, bestowed voting rights. With their newfound rights, several African Americans were elected to political office at the national level. Hiram Revels of Mississippi even took the former seat of Confederate President Jefferson Davis in the U.S. Senate. Soon, however, particularly in southern states, a Jim Crow system would be implemented that undermined these rights. 8 Breaking baseball's color barrier. Although African Americans had long excelled at baseball in the Negro Leagues, no Major League Baseball team had ever signed a black player to play professional ball with white players. That changed in the mid-1940s, when Branch Rickey, president of the Brooklyn Dodgers, hatched a plan to sign an African American player. In October 1945, Rickey signed Jackie Robinson of the Kansas City Monarchs, and Robinson played a season with the minor league Montreal Royals. Then, in 1947, Robinson was promoted to the Major League club, becoming the first black player in the major leagues in 63 years. Robinson won the National League Rookie of the Year award in 1947 and became, in 1949, the league's MVP. Still, he endured invectives and even had bottles hurled at him, and some of his teammates openly protested having to play with him. In some cities, Robinson couldn't even stay in the same hotel as his teammates or eat in the same restaurant. As he later recalled, "Plenty of times I wanted to haul off when somebody insulted me for the color of my skin, but I had to hold to myself. I knew I was kind of an experiment. The whole thing was bigger than me." 7 Integrating the military. Black Americans had always served in their country's armed forces from the time of the American Revolution, and at that time black and white soldiers fought alongside one another. However, the integration of the 1770s was not repeated until the mid-20th century. In June 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ended discrimination in the defense industry, but the armed services remained segregated. In October 1947, the President's Committee on Civil Rights proposed to end segregation in the armed services. Facing resistance from Southern senators and a potential filibuster, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, abolishing once and for all racial segregation in the U.S. military. 6. Integrating the schools, with all deliberate speed. No story of the civil rights movement can be told without Brown v. Board of Education, which was decided in 1954. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court had issued its separate but equal ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, which stipulated that segregation was permissible. In practice, separate was emphasized rather than equal. Particularly in the South, but not only there, schools were racially segregated, and schools serving African American students were generally inferior. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously, 9-0, in Brown that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Arguing for the plaintiffs, the suits were filed by the NAACP on behalf of black students, was Thurgood Marshall, who would go on to become the first African American to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. In a subsequent opinion on the question of relief, commonly referred to as Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, 2, argued April 11 to 14, 1955, and decided on May 31 of that year, Chief Justice Earl Warren ordered the district courts and local school authorities to take appropriate steps to integrate public schools in their jurisdictions with all deliberate speed. Public schools in southern states, however, remained almost completely segregated until the late 1960s. 5. Standing up by sitting down, Part 1. Rosa Parks is often called the mother of the civil rights movement for her role in sparking the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-56. On December 1, 1955, she was arrested for refusing to give her bus seat to a white man, a violation of the city's racial segregation ordinances. Under the aegis of the Montgomery Improvement Association and the leadership of the young pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Martin Luther King, Jr., a boycott of the municipal bus company was begun on December 5. The boycott would last until December 21, 1956, with total victory for the protesters, following the Supreme Court's upholding, in November, of a lower court's decision declaring Montgomery's segregated seating unconstitutional. Parks went on to receive numerous awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, 1996, and the Congressional Gold Medal, 1999. After her death in 2005, her body lay in state in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, making her the first woman and the second black person to receive that honor. For standing up by sitting down, Part 2. Although victories came in Supreme Court rulings on education and in seating on buses, not all segregation was wiped away easily, so on February 1, 1960, the Greensboro Four, Azell Blair, Jr., later Jabril Kazan, Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond, all students at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, North Carolina, entered a Woolworth store that had a dining area. They purchased items and then sat at the lunch counter, which was reserved for whites only. They politely requested service at the counter, remaining seated while their orders were refused by the waitstaff. The lunch counter manager contacted the police, but the local media had already been alerted. The police arrived, only to declare that they could do nothing because the four black men were paying customers of the store and had not taken any provocative actions. The media response, however, was immediate. A photo of the Greensboro Four appeared in local newspapers, and the protest quickly expanded. The next day they returned to Woolworth's, this time with 20 other students, and the scene played out again over the following days, students sitting in even on the sidewalk outside. The sit-ins spread throughout the country, and dining facilities throughout the South began to be integrated. Finally, in July 1960, the lunch counter at the Greensboro Woolworths was serving black patrons, providing a template for nonviolent resistance. 3. Marching for jobs and freedom. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King, Jr., led an interracial peaceful assembly of some 250,000 people in the shadows of the Lincoln Memorial to demand equal justice for all citizens. The culmination of the March on Washington was King's inspiring I Have a Dream speech, in which he emphasized his belief in a future when, as he put it, my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. As King historian Claiborne Carson argues in his article on the civil rights movement for Britannica, King used the speech as an opportunity to link black civil rights aspirations with traditional American political values. He insisted that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution comprised a promissory note guaranteeing all Americans the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 2. Civil rights, finally. The trajectory since the 1940s had been toward full political equality for African Americans, but along the way there were setbacks as well as successes. Finally, on July 2, 1964, that goal was realized, as President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The law was intended to end discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin and has often been called the most important U.S. law on civil rights since Reconstruction, 1865-77. Though near universally supported today, the Civil Rights Act was a highly controversial issue in the United States as soon as it was proposed by President John F. Kennedy in 1963. Although Kennedy was unable to secure passage of the bill in Congress, a stronger version was eventually passed with the urging of his successor, President Lyndon B. Johnson, who signed the bill into law on July 2, 1964, following one of the longest debates in Senate history. White people opposed to integration with African Americans responded to the act with a significant backlash that took the form of protests, increased support for pro-segregation candidates for public office, and some racial violence. The constitutionality of the act was immediately challenged and was upheld by the Supreme Court in the test case Heart of Atlanta Motel v. U.S., 1964. The act gave federal law enforcement agencies the power to prevent racial discrimination in employment, voting, and the use of public facilities. The act was followed the next year by the Voting Rights Act, which aimed to ensure that black citizens could exercise their right to vote under the 15th Amendment. 1. The Million Man March. 32 years after King's March on Washington, Louis Farrakhan, the leader of the Nation of Islam, organized the Million Man March in Washington, D.C., to promote African American unity and values and to bring about a spiritual renewal that would instill a sense of personal responsibility in African American men for improving the condition of African Americans. Estimates of the number of marchers on October 16, 1995, most of whom were black men, ranged from 400,000 to nearly 1.1 million, ranking it among the largest gatherings of its kind in American history. The event was directed by Benjamin F. Chavis, Jr., the former head of the NAACP, and attracted many prominent African Americans, including Jesse Jackson, Rosa Parks, Cornel West, and Maya Angelou, though a number of black leaders did not attend, including Mary Frances Berry, chairman of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and Representative John Lewis, the latter of whom saw Farrakhan's message as an effort to resegregate America. It was reported that in response to the march, some 1.7 million African American men registered to vote.